Oh boy, it must be Christmas. Not only am I going to get to correct a woman on matters of military history, I am going to get to make the argument for why the United States of America nuking Japan twice was not only a justifiable act, but an absolute moral necessity, and thus a highly positive act as well. Oh, I have dreamt of this day for years. And finally, here we are. So, a little interesting video popped up on Twitter in response to the Oppenheimer movie, and I figured we'd have a look at it together because this is a topic I could rant on for quite some time, so enjoy, I suppose.
Alright, so I just finished watching Oppenheimer like thousands of other people, and there's something the movie didn't get into. Let me explain. The movie doesn't outright challenge the decision to use the bombs against Japanese civilians. It's actually in line with the US refusal to confront crimes committed against Japan and the justification that the bombs were necessary to end the war. Okay.
Right, so we are going to move on now to talk to a historian in the movie, video, who actually isn't a historian on the actual conflict, which seems rather pointless to me, which is why we're going to cut in right here. So, the entire justification for the usage of the nuclear bombs was 100% correct. It was to force the Japanese government to surrender once and for all, and finally, without the need for an invasion of mainland Japan, which would have been... oh boy... let's just say that I expect the casualty figures, which were, about 500,000 to a million American soldiers, to be, if anything, conservative. In fact, all of the Purple Hearts that were produced for that invasion, they are still in use today. The US has not actually run out of Purple Hearts ever since they started commissioning them for the invasion of Japan. And to understand why this is to understand the Japanese. It is very important, you see, that the Japanese weren't like us. They were not a regular Western military power or a regular Western military nation. Our line of thinking cannot be applied to Japan in World War II. They had not left feudalism behind by even 100 years, as they had begun basically in the Meiji Restoration era. Their first modern war was in 1904, at which point feudal peasants from rice paddies were given guns, given basic instructions how to organize themselves, as Japan underwent its first proper massive mobilization for the war against Russia. This was Japan's first taste of modern warfare just before the First World War and the Second World War. And so by the time the Second World War actually rolls around, Japan is still at large a fairly primitive country. And this is important, not in as mocking their technology, because some of the technological achievements, especially in terms of submarines and the Zero, were actually quite impressive, but in terms of their spirituality. In the West, we had long since rejected largely the ideas of God and spirits, etc. quite some time ago, a good 100, 200 years at least, if not more, you could easily argue. Whereas in Japan, the idea of the divine emperor, the Tenno Heika, was not merely something we said, it wasn't some fuzzy concept, it was observable reality to them, and it was being hammered home to them with constant state propaganda from they were children. For example, you could not show up at school with your lunch packed in a newspaper if the newspaper happened to have a picture of the emperor in it. That was very, very verboten. And we could go in at length about the rather heavy-duty beliefs of the Japanese people at the time, where even any competing scholar, for example, that disagreed with the official narrative was simply just cancel cultured out of existence. It was a culture of extreme obedience and loyalty to the divine emperor. And this is how we explain the fact that the Japanese just didn't surrender. Like, ever. You can have comparisons to this in the war in Europe as well. Surrenders on the Eastern Front, for example, were quite rare because both sides knew that the other side really didn't like them very much. But they still happened. Whereas the Japanese were virtually impossible to get to surrender, despite the fact that they were overmatched in every single solitary regard. Tanks? Oh god, yes. Aircraft, ships, weaponry, men, technology... all of it. The Japanese, if you look at the casualty figure comparisons between the Japanese and the Americans, who, mind you, were launching routinely amphibious invasions on Japanese soil and the various occupied areas, which was probably some of the most dangerous invasion things to do, it is ridiculous. It was a thoroughly one-sided conflict on virtually every single solitary level, and the only reason the Japanese held on for as long as they did was because of that fanaticism. This fanaticism is also demonstrated in why they would not surrender, because they simply could not surrender. Only Emperor Hirohito could actually surrender, and in the end, he didn't even really do that. In his speech where he actually announces that Japan is giving up the fight, he doesn't actually say they're defeated or that they surrender. He merely tells the Japanese people to bear the unbearable. Now, this can in part be explained by the fact as well that the Japanese don't quite speak like we do. It was considered to be a far more, floral language, even back then, of course, and even today, I mean. And so even though every Japanese person understood what that meant, it actually took quite some time before the Westerners went like, is that, are they giving up? They're probably giving up, right? And the Japanese were even attempting to surrender before the nuclear bomb. They had sent out peace feelers to the Soviet Union, which turned out to be a relatively bad idea because the USSR were planning to invade Japan as well, but they didn't want to send them to the US because that would be seen as an official surrender attempt, and that was a big, big no-no, as the civilian government and the military government were deadlocked. The military government could not admit they were losing for fear of losing face, and by the way, incidentally here, losing face as a military commander in Japan at the time wasn't a mere thing of like, oh, I have been dishonorable. No. Lower military officers routinely killed higher military officers for perceived lacks of dedication to the emperor. I'm not shitting you. It was a period in which higher officers were often living in deadly fear of their subordinates. This is one of the reasons why Isoroku Yamamoto was actually sent from Japan to an on-sea command to keep him from being assassinated. And the civilian government couldn't go up against the military government for fear of a military coup. And Emperor Hirohito couldn't actually override either one because it wasn't technically his place to do so, even though he was the emperor. The Japanese were weird, okay? And so only when being given with an absolutely unavoidable excuse to surrender, which was 1, the Soviets invading en masse, and 2, a couple of enormous firebombs wiping out a pair of cities, was it possible to actually force everyone to finally bend over and accept it. The nukes were the only way that would not have cost another probably 2 to 3 million lives, 1 or so American, and 2 to 3 Japanese, if not more. It would have been far worse had it been come to a ground invasion. But let's continue.
This historian Naoko Wake, who's talked to dozens of survivors who can give us better context.
It's a very limited one aspect of the history of the bomb. They don't want to raise any questions about the accepted notion of World War II as a good war.
Yes. The accepted notion of World War II as a good war. Weirdly, you don't hear this argument being made about the Germans all often. Okay, so here's the thing. I really get the Japanese position here. Okay? I do. I unironically do. Okay? They were being forced into a position where they had to wage war because of their rapidly industrializing nation simply not having access to the industrial resources they required to continue growing. They were trying to find them in China, but they were getting completely and utterly deadlocked. Then America began waging economic war on Japan. Very blatant economic war in Japan, including seizing Japanese assets in America and of course embargoing their access to oil. This was a death knell for Japan, as they knew they could only actually maintain their industry and their war machine for so many years after that point before any attempt at expansion or resistance would be rendered completely and utterly impossible. In other words, for Japan, the only options were do or die. And I would certainly argue that a certain American president is almost as much at fault for the war as the Japanese are. But as it turned out, the Japanese had a far itchier trigger finger, deciding that they needed to strike first and hard in an effort to try and knock America out of the war quickly. Now, ironically, they would probably actually have been better off with their original plan of the Kantai Kessen rather than strike on Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, at the very least if they hadn't followed through with Minoru Genji's idea of actually invading Hawaii and Pearl Harbor as well, which might actually have placed America in a really terrible position. Incidentally, the movement of the fleet from California to Pearl Harbor was also a very calculated, aggressive move by America to try and go, hey Japan, hey, we know what you're doing over there in China, and if you're not careful, we're gonna come and mess you up. And the Japanese, for some mysterious reason, took that as a challenge. But, all that being said, the Japanese did some absolutely gruesome shit. Okay? Oh my god. If you ever want to get a few nightmares, look up Unit 731. You'll be quite fascinated. Or I could recommend the movie Nuking, the rape of Nanking, alternatively. Nanking Crying, I think is another title of it. To get just a little bit of an idea of how the Japanese behaved in China. Or you can watch The Bridge over the River Kwai, etc. The Japanese were they used to be a feudal people, again, just 100-odd years before this, and thus, when they entered into modern conflict against other modern foes, their behavioral pattern were not, necessarily merciful. They were, in fact, rather feudal in nature. And so, the war against Japan was indeed a good war, because it was against a definitively worse opponent. I can criticize the way it was started, absolutely, and I can most assuredly criticize the way in which it was initiated, sure. But it was a good war.
You depend on it, right?
Under international law today, those two nuclear attacks are by definition war crimes.
Oh, honey, let's... Oh, darling, let's... Alright, so here's another thing, right? The nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't actually the worst things the Americans did to Japan. Not by a long shot. Oh, God, no. The strategic bombing campaign of Japan, particularly the uses of incendiary ordnance targeting Japanese cities largely built out of sticks and flammable paper, were absolutely devastating. Read the stories of the Tokyo firestorm, for example. Hoi boy. The nuclear bombs were a mercy compared to further years of mass strategic bombing, especially when the Allies started figuring out firebombing. Again, look up Dresden. I'm sure they were war crimes, and you can certainly make a very solid argument as well that the Allies committed a fair few war crimes themselves during the Second World War, but here's the thing. When you're at war, most of these silly little rules tend to fly out the window awfully quickly. They are neat theoreticals, and on some levels they are usually followed. For example, the warfare between the Allies and the Germans on the Western Front in Europe tended to be significantly more humane than that on the Eastern Front, or versus the Japanese, mind you. Again, oh boy. But by and large, these rules of war are kind of nonsensical, and tends to fly out the window the moment you are actually fighting against a genuine opponent, and not some backwater dirt hole that you can bomb to smithereens from the safety of, well, you know, low orbit.
Why? Because the majority of victims at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were civilians. The bombings killed around 200,000 people, and
many of them suffered long-term radiation illnesses. Those types of cancer do not show up until decades later. Many of them decided not to have family at all. They didn't want to have children because they were afraid of deformity.
Now let's not forget, the US is literally the only country ever to use nuclear weapons in war. And after 78 years, not a single US president has apologized to the victims.
Because they shouldn't. Again, the nuclear bombings were absolutely justified and moral, as I've already explained, and they should not apologize for it simply because, in retrospect, people go, well, that was kind of terrible. Yeah, but comparatively, 200,000 people, again, would not have amounted to a third of the casualties. No, what were we looking at here? We're looking at 500,000 odd Americans, so it wouldn't amount to half of the American casualties from Operation Downfall, and then you throw on 1 to 2 million Japanese people on top of that. Yeah, comparatively, the bombs were a mercy.
So he's in Japan, in Hiroshima, and that's fine. Just as long as he doesn't apologize, it's absolutely fine. Who cares?
Do you feel like the US has ever taken accountability for what they have done?
No.
And let me stop you there. Do you feel like Japan has ever taken accountability for what they've done? Let me tell you something a little bit funny. In Japan, it is still commonly bandied around the idea that the Second World War was basically Japan sitting around doing nothing particularly wrong, and then the evil gaijin came along to spoil the fun. That is a fairly commonly held perception amongst the Japanese people. The view on the Second World War in Japan is radically different than in the West.
US government refused to recognize their existence, not to mention their suffering. They instead use survivors as guinea pigs. They use them as research subjects.
Why do you think the US is so adamant to not take accountability on this issue?
Because it exposes the fact that so-called good war, the image of World War II as glorious war, to lose that is very much a threat against America's national interest as well as national security.
By the way,
And hey, I mean, that's sort of pseudo-correct, but once more, it was a good war. And interesting enough, this next part is kind of cute.
this isn't limited to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This fits perfectly with America's pattern of avoiding accountability for crimes committed. I mean, take a look at the Marshall Islands. The people there say the government has not fairly compensated them for the lasting health and environmental effects of 67 nuclear bomb tests.
My fellow historian Ron Zwingbenberg, he mentioned something that's a stereotypically American thing to do is to bomb people and later on ask them how they feel.
So yes, Oppenheimer is
You know why they did that? Because they didn't know what the damn bombs did. Unironically, that's why. When they bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was still the idea that Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, might still continue. Do you know what the American instructions to American soldiers were if they were to approach the area that had been struck by a nuclear weapon? It was to not do so for 48 hours. Until after the explosion. The Americans had no goddamn clue about any of this. In fact, this is kind of the weird part about the things. This is supposed to be in reaction to Oppenheimer, right? Well, one of the key things about the movie is that nobody really knew what the hell this thing was going to do. Some people doubted it would even explode, others expected that it might ignite the entire atmosphere, which luckily didn't happen. And as for the effect on radiation, nobody had the faintest clue. That's why they used survivors as you say, guinea pigs, because they were trying to figure out, okay, what the hell is this? What are the ramifications of it? And only slowly but surely, as we began realizing just how nasty the nuclear radiation was, did we begin worrying about the actual large-scale ramifications of it. Because, of course, the view of today of nuclear bombs was not the view then.
a historical film, but the threat posed by nuclear weapons is all too relevant. 9 countries currently possess thousands of nuclear weapons, with the United States and Russia having about 90% of them. So why does it matter how the US talks about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, if the US avoids reckoning with its past usage of nuclear weapons, it raises the concern of how they may be used in the future, and against whom.
Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. The US have already studied Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's why they carried out the other 67 odd tests, because they were trying to figure out what a nuclear weapon was and how to employ it. At a time, the idea was that you'd use nuclear weapons as tactical weapons, that you'd just nuke goddamn everything. What was it? Was it MacArthur that mentioned that he wanted to turn basically a part of Korea into an enormous nuclear radiated ditch to just glass the Chinese? The thing was, it was viewed as more or less a conventional weapon at the time, which you would simply just throw at the enemy to force them to surrender. This was also, in part, the reason behind the deployment of the nuclear weapons against Japan. It was also an effort to kind of look at the Soviet Union and go, And they were hoping that they would have the usage of nukes alone as their sole singular prowess for quite some time, but that didn't actually work out all that well. And to be fair, that is probably one of the reasons why only Japan has been nuked. If the US had found out that they actually had a far longer and greater monopoly on nuclear weapons than they actually ended up having, well, it's entirely possible that they might have nuked a couple of the countries for shits and giggles as well. But we have actually figured out what these things are. And as for your 9,000 nuclear weapons, yes, these 9,000 nuclear weapons have ushered in, literally, the greatest era of peace and security in human history. Never before has planet Earth been this stable. Never before has war been so distant as prospect. And why? Because we could fucking crater each other 7 ways till the moon comes down and clashes on us. That's why. Actually, nuclear weapons are pretty amazing because they're so dangerous and so well understood that no one in their right mind would ever actually fire them. And yet, simultaneously, the mere threat that somebody might be batshit insane enough to do so is keeping us all away from large-scale war between the superpowers. So yeah, not only were the nuking of Japan a good thing, and America understands that, but it ushered in an era of unprecedented peace. So, sorry Japan, but you kind of deserve that one. And hey, you're doing quite a lot better, aren't you? I mean, ironically, yes. You can say a lot of mean things about the Japanese during the Second World War, but you cannot criticize them for their go-getter attitude after the war, as not only did they industrialize in an unfathomably fast time in the 1800s, they then rebuilt their country from the shattered ruins, not only from nuclear destruction, but firebombing, to one of the world's leading economies in record time. And this is why Japan was such a threat and such a challenge, even though they were outnumbered and outgunned in virtually every regard. The Japanese be crazy, yo, in both good ways and bad ways. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.